There is a kind of silence that terrifies the people who once thrived on your chaos. It's the silence that follows an empath's final decision, the moment they stop explaining, stop forgiving, stop returning, the moment they disappear without warning, without closure, without permission. The world calls it detachment. But to an empath, it is resurrection. You see, when an empath walks away, they are not leaving another person. They are leaving the battlefield of their own self-betrayal. The empath's quiet exit is not weakness. It is not surrender. It is evolution in its purest, most devastating form. For years, you absorbed everything. You carried the emotions of others like invisible weights. You listened to their excuses, felt their pain, forgave their cruelty. You became their mirror, their therapist, their confessional. You mistook your compassion for duty, and they mistook your empathy for endless tolerance. But one day, something inside you breaks not from fragility, but from awakening. Carl Jung called it individuation, the moment the soul begins to reclaim itself from the projections of others. The moment you realize that saving people is not love, it's control. That enabling someone's darkness in the name of compassion is not kindness, it's bondage. You see, empaths don't just feel others, they internalize them. They become emotional alchemists, transforming the poison of others into temporary peace. But every act of emotional rescue comes with a cost. A little less energy, a little less clarity, a little less self. You start to mistake exhaustion for empathy, confusion for connection, pain for love. And then, one day, the realization hits. You are drowning in an ocean you never created. That's the day you go quiet. No confrontation, no explosion, just silence. Because the empath's final act of power is withdrawal. You don't need revenge. Your absence is the revenge. When you walk away, you take with you the very thing they depended on: your energy, your validation, your emotional gravity. You remove the mirror that reflected their importance. You take the light that made them visible. And in that vacuum, they are forced to meet themselves. That is the empath's darkest revenge. You make them face what they truly are without your compassion to soften the edges. It's poetic, really. The same heart that once shielded others becomes their silent reckoning. The same soul that once absorbed pain now radiates boundaries, sharp enough to cut through illusion. Jung wrote that the meeting of two personalities is like the contact of two chemical substances. If there is any reaction, both are transformed. But the empath's tragedy is that only one side transformed until now. The empath changes again, but this time the transformation is inward. The power that was once externalized through healing becomes internalized through sovereignty. This is where your quiet exit becomes alchemy. You begin to see that not everyone deserves access to your empathy. Compassion without discernment is self-destruction. Forgiveness without distance is enslavement. Love without boundaries is spiritual suicide. You understand now that some people don't want healing, they want an audience. They want to remain broken because their wounds are their identity. And the empath, in their innocence, keeps trying to fix what was never meant to be mended. But when you go quiet, something extraordinary happens. You meet the person you were before the world taught you to be soft for everyone else. You remember the sacred rage that lives beneath your gentleness, the fire that says, no more. Jung called this the integration of the shadow, the process of reclaiming the power you suppressed in the name of being good. The empath's silence is not passive. It is the moment they reclaim their shadow and let it guard their heart. That is the part the world fears most. The empath who has learned boundaries. The empath who no longer explains. The empath who smiles instead of arguing, who blocks instead of begging, who disappears instead of defending. Because once the empath realizes that not every cry for help is sacred, once they stop confusing emotional chaos with depth, they become untouchable. Their compassion sharpens into discernment. Their kindness transforms into quiet strength. And that quiet strength terrifies the manipulators, the narcissists, the emotional parasites who once thrived on the empath's endless supply of understanding. Because empathy without boundaries is their favorite addiction, and your silence is their withdrawal. You see, most people mistake empathy for fragility. They believe sensitivity equals submission. But the truth is, empathy is not weakness, it's awareness. And awareness is power. You see what others refuse to see. You feel what others cannot name. And that terrifies those who live by illusion. That is why they try to convince you that your sensitivity was a flaw, because your perception threatened their masks. Your intuition read their shadows too clearly, and so they called you too much, too sensitive, overreactive, hoping you would doubt your own sight. But you don't doubt anymore. You've learned to trust the energy, not the excuses, the patterns, not the promises. You've learned that silence reveals more truth than words ever could. When you walk away in silence, you are not running, you are returning. Returning to yourself, to your truth, to your peace. You are no longer a mirror for others. You are the light that reveals them. This is the empath's evolution, from healer to seer, from caretaker to creator, from victim to vessel of awareness. You no longer absorb energy, you transmute it. You no longer carry emotions, you channel them into wisdom. You no longer chase closure, you embody it. The empath's quiet exit is not the end of compassion. It is its purification. Because true compassion includes the self. True empathy begins with your own soul. Jung understood this deeply. He said, the most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely. And that is what you've done. You've accepted that your light has limits, that your love cannot redeem the unwilling, that your peace cannot coexist with chaos. You've learned that sometimes the most spiritual act is to close the door softly and never return. When you disappear, you are not abandoning anyone. You are liberating yourself from a contract you never signed. You are ending a story that was draining your spirit dry. You are giving yourself permission to exist unedited. And the world will feel your absence. Those who used you as a source of validation will feel the collapse of their own emptiness. They will search for you in others and find only shadows. They will realize far too late that your energy was not replaceable. But by then, you will have already transformed. You will be living in a new vibration, one where your empathy is sacred, not spent, where your silence is power, not punishment, where your love is chosen, not coerced. The empath's quiet exit is not revenge, because revenge belongs to the ego, but it feels like revenge to those who once fed on your light. Because when they reach for you, you're no longer there. When they speak your name, you no longer respond. When they test your boundaries, there is only silence. That silence is the sound of freedom. It is the sound of every time you said yes when you wanted to say no. Every time you forgave too quickly. Every time you poured from an empty cup. It is the sound of your healing, not loud, not dramatic, but absolute. And in that silence you rise. You stop apologizing for your depth. You stop shrinking your empathy to fit shallow places. You stop explaining your worth to people who were never capable of seeing it. You begin to understand what Jung meant when he said, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. Your empathy, once unconscious, has become conscious. It no longer directs you into wounds disguised as relationships. It no longer seeks brokenness to fix. It no longer mistakes toxicity for intensity. You now see the pattern, and by seeing it, you transcend it. This is what the empath's quiet exit truly is. Not abandonment, but ascension. It is the moment the healer heals themselves. The moment the giver gives back to their own soul. The moment the listener finally listens inward. And that is why your silence shakes the ground, because you have turned your energy inward. You have become the source. You have taken back everything you gave away. Your light is no longer for consumption. It is for creation. And the world, though it may not understand it yet, needs that version of you far more than the one who stayed too long. Because your empathy, once exhausted, has become wisdom. Your softness, once exploited, has become steel. That is not bitterness, it is balance. You are not the same person who once cried for being misunderstood. You are now the person who smiles quietly and walks away. You no longer explain. You no longer chase. You no longer negotiate your value. You exist in quiet command. That is the power of the empath who has awakened. Your silence is no longer emptiness. It is full of boundaries, of clarity, of truth. And that fullness is louder than any revenge could ever be. Because the empath's quiet exit is not the end of love, it is its purification. It is not the death of empathy, it is its resurrection. It is the moment the soul stops bleeding for others and begins to burn for itself. And that flame, silent, steady, sovereign, is the darkest, most beautiful revenge there is. And once you reach that point, when the silence no longer feels like emptiness, but like power, everything begins to shift. The same places that used to drain you now feel distant, irrelevant. The same people who once controlled you with guilt now fade into static noise. You realize that what you thought was love was often dependency, and what you mistook for loyalty was self-abandonment. You finally see the truth Jung tried to teach the modern soul, that all suffering begins with unconsciousness. You suffered because you were asleep in your empathy, mistaking absorption for connection, martyrdom for love. You were living from instinct, not from awareness. You were reacting to pain instead of alchemizing it. But when the empath awakens, everything turns. The energy you once spent fixing others becomes the energy you now use to build yourself. The empathy that once blinded you becomes discernment. The compassion that once made you naive becomes vision. You begin to see not through emotion, but through truth. The world will sense it immediately. The ones who once played with your heart will feel it first. They'll come back not because they've changed, but because they can feel the withdrawal of your light. They'll sense the silence as if the air itself has shifted. They'll call it arrogance. They'll call it coldness. But it is neither. It is sovereignty. You no longer perform empathy to be worthy of love. You no longer chase understanding to avoid abandonment. You no longer confuse presence with submission. You understand that saying no is also an act of love to yourself and to the truth. And that's the most terrifying thing about your quiet exit. You didn't just walk away from a person. You walked away from a pattern. That pattern of overgiving, of explaining, of trying to be understood is ancient. It has roots in your childhood, in your lineage, in centuries of conditioning that taught sensitive souls to earn safety by pleasing others. The empath's wound is collective. The healer's exhaustion is inherited. But the moment you go silent, that entire chain breaks, because now you understand what Jung called the shadow of the healer. He warned that those who help others often hide their own hunger to be needed. The empath's compassion can become an unconscious addiction, a need to feel indispensable, a need to fix to feel alive. But now that need dissolves. You no longer seek importance through pain. You no longer define yourself by who you save. You no longer need chaos to feel meaning. Instead, you learn stillness. You learn solitude. You learn that peace is not loneliness, it is alignment. The empath's silence becomes their sanctuary. It becomes a temple where you finally meet yourself, not as a reflection of anyone else, but as your own creation. At first, the silence is disorienting. You miss the noise because it distracted you from your emptiness. But slowly, that emptiness reveals itself to be space, space where your true self begins to expand. You start creating, dreaming, moving without explaining. You begin to speak not to please, but to express. You begin to give, not to be seen, but to share your abundance. The empath's quiet exit becomes not a retreat, but a rebirth. You begin to see that your empathy was never meant to be a wound. It was meant to be a weapon. not a sword of destruction, but of discernment. You wield it with precision now. You can feel deceit without needing proof. You can sense manipulation in a smile. You can walk into a room and instantly know who carries peace and who carries poison. And that awareness, that silent knowing, is power. Not the loud, aggressive power of the ego, but the magnetic, untouchable power of one who has seen their own depths and survived. It's the power of Jung's individuated soul, a being no longer fragmented by external influence, a being who has united their light and shadow into one integrated force, a being who walks through the world, not seeking validation, but emanating presence. You become that presence. Your quiet becomes an atmosphere. Your energy, once scattered in 1,000 directions, now radiates like a calm storm. People will feel it. Some will be drawn to it, the ones ready to meet their own truth. Others will avoid it, the ones still hiding from theirs. Both reactions are proof of your growth. The empath's silence doesn't just change relationships, it changes reality. You stop attracting chaos because you no longer resonate with it. You stop tolerating disrespect because it no longer feels familiar. You stop chasing validation because you've remembered your own divine source. You have become what Jung would call a self-regulating system, a soul that no longer depends on external forces to maintain balance. You no longer swing between extremes, between giving too much and collapsing in depletion. You now live from your center, anchored, grounded, unshakable. And in that state, revenge no longer even exists. It's beneath you. What once felt like dark revenge now feels like sacred release. You don't need to prove your worth. You don't need to punish. Life does it for you. Every soul who crossed your boundaries will face the echo of their own actions, not by your hand, but by universal law, because energy never lies. What is taken without gratitude always returns in emptiness. What is given without respect always returns in loss. Those who exploited your empathy will one day crave it in others and find only mirrors of themselves. That is not vengeance, it is balance. Your silence initiated that balance. That's why it's dark. Not because it's cruel, but because it comes from the part of you the world never expected you to embrace: your shadow, your power, your refusal to keep bleeding for those who fear their own healing. The empath's shadow is not evil, it is clarity. It is the voice that whispers, "You deserve peace too." It is the force that finally says, "I will not participate in my own suffering anymore." That voice, calm, ancient, undeniable, is the voice of your soul remembering itself. And that remembrance is liberation. It's what every empath must eventually discover. Your gift is not to absorb pain, but to transmute it. Your role is not to fix others, but to become so whole that your very presence invites others to heal themselves. You become the embodiment of what Jung called the self in alignment with the divine. The part of consciousness that no longer hides behind masks, that no longer fears rejection, that no longer seeks permission to exist. You've gone through the sacred inversion, the moment where empathy becomes sovereignty, where love becomes wisdom, where silence becomes song. And that song, your silence, becomes the purest vibration of freedom in the world. It says to the universe, "I am done performing my pain. I am ready to live my peace." That is why your exit feels like a funeral to those who thrived on your giving, because it is. It's the death of their illusion of control, the death of their access to your light, the death of the version of you who mistook love for sacrifice. But to you, it is not death, it is resurrection. The empath who rises from that silence is not who they were before. They have faced their shadow and befriended it. They have found stillness inside chaos. They have learned that boundaries are sacred altars, not walls. You walk now not as a savior, but as a sovereign. You do not preach love, you radiate it. You do not chase peace, you carry it. You do not fight darkness, You illuminate it simply by existing, and the world will notice. The same people who once dismissed you will sense something they can't name. The same voices that once called you too sensitive will now call you mysterious, powerful, different. They won't understand what changed, but you will. You learned the hardest truth of all, that empathy without self-respect is self-erasure. And now that you respect your own soul, your empathy has become divine. That is the empath's quiet exit, not a withdrawal, but a return, not a punishment, but an initiation, not revenge, but revelation. And that revelation is the one Jung saw in every awakened being, that when you finally withdraw your energy from those who misuse it, you don't become cold, you become free. When you stop explaining your worth, you don't lose love, you find it. When you stop trying to heal others, you finally start to heal yourself. That is not cruelty. That is consciousness. And consciousness, silent, sovereign, unshakable, is the most powerful revenge the empath could ever choose. And as you walk further into that freedom, you begin to notice that silence has a sound. It's not the absence of noise, it's the presence of truth. The world doesn't understand it because most people confuse peace with boredom. But you, the empath who has walked through fire and shadow, understand that silence is sacred. It is the sound of your own energy unpolluted by chaos. In that silence, your intuition becomes sharp again. The fog lifts. You start to see things as they are, not as you wish them to be. You recognize manipulation before it speaks, deceit before it acts, emptiness before it drains. The clarity feels divine because it is. It is your soul reuniting with its own intelligence. Jung called this the return of the repressed self. It is the moment your psyche stops fragmenting to please the world and begins to revolve around its own center again. And that center is calm, not because life is easy now, but because you no longer resist what you know. When you were asleep in empathy, you mistook kindness for obligation. You believed that to be loving meant to be endlessly available, endlessly understanding. But that belief was a chain disguised as virtue. You see now that real love has boundaries, that mercy without limits becomes martyrdom. You've learned that the most compassionate thing you can do for others is to stop enabling their unconsciousness. That is the empath's paradox. You had to learn that healing someone who refuses to grow is not compassion, it's interference. When you rescue someone from the consequences of their own behavior, you are not saving them. You are delaying their awakening. And so your silence becomes medicine. It is not a punishment, it is a mirror. It reflects truth back to those who once used your forgiveness as cover for their avoidance. It forces them to sit with themselves, perhaps for the first time, without your energy to absorb their pain. Some will grow from that mirror. Most will run from it. But that is no longer your concern, because you, the empath, have crossed the threshold Jung called transcendence of opposites. You no longer live in the polarity of victim and rescuer, love and resentment, giving and depletion. You have merged them into wholeness. You no longer choose between strength and softness, you have become both. You have entered the state of quiet power, the energy that does not react, does not explain, does not perform. It simply is. And from that state, you begin to attract a different world. People who are not threatened by your boundaries, but inspired by them. Connections rooted not in dependency, but in mutual awareness. You attract souls who do not feed on your energy, but harmonize with it. That is how the empath's life transforms. When you stop chasing, what's meant for you finds you. When you stop absorbing pain, you start emitting peace. When you stop explaining, your presence starts speaking for you. It's a strange thing. The more you detach, the more magnetic you become. Not because you're playing games, but because your energy is finally sovereign. You no longer radiate need. You no longer vibrate confusion. Your frequency is clear. I am whole within myself. That frequency is irresistible, not just to people, but to life itself. Opportunities start flowing, synchronicities multiply. The world, once chaotic, starts responding with coherence. It's not magic, it's physics. The law of resonance that Jung spoke of in his studies of synchronicity, the inner and outer worlds are mirrors. When the inner world becomes ordered, the outer follows. And yet, none of this was achieved through control, only through release. You didn't fight for this power. You remembered it. It was always yours. You finally understand what every mystic has always whispered. Peace is not found by escaping the world, but by no longer being enslaved by it. The empath who reaches this point no longer needs to defend their silence. It speaks for itself. They no longer need to prove their purity. Their energy proves it for them. They no longer need to prove their strength. Their calmness announces it the moment they enter a room. Because calmness is not the absence of emotion, it is mastery over it. It is the awareness that every emotion is a visitor, not an identity. It is the realization that nothing anyone says or does can define you unless you consent to it. This is the empath's final evolution when your peace becomes impenetrable. You can walk through chaos and remain untouched. You can witness cruelty without internalizing it. You can feel deeply without drowning. This is what Jung meant when he said, "No tree can grow to heaven unless its roots reach down to hell." You have gone down. You have faced the shadows, yours and others. You have walked through your personal hell of emotional entanglement and emerged with roots deep enough to hold heaven. And now you are unshakable. People who once drained you will no longer understand you. They will misread your calm for arrogance, your silence for distance, your boundaries for cruelty. Let them. You no longer translate your peace for minds addicted to noise. You no longer explain your worth to hearts that can't recognize gold. Because you have realized that peace does not need an audience. Power does not need performance. And love, real love, does not require pain to prove itself. You live differently now. You speak less, but every word carries weight. You give less, but what you give heals deeply. You move slower, but every step is deliberate. You have learned the rarest art, the art of restraint, and in that restraint you discover something profound. Detachment is not indifference, it is wisdom. Detachment means you can love without losing yourself. You can care without controlling. You can give without needing to be seen. You can walk away without anger. You can forgive without reopening the door. That is the empath's real power, not to feel everything, but to choose what deserves to be felt. Not to absorb every frequency, but to protect your own. And so, the empath's quiet exit becomes more than revenge. It becomes an act of divine balance, the restoration of sacred order within the self. You are not cold. You are clear. You are not distant. You are discerning. You are not cruel. You are finally conscious. You are no longer the mirror reflecting others' chaos. You are now the window through which light enters the world. And that light, your silence, your stillness, your self-awareness, is the purest revolution there is. Because the world does not change through noise. It changes when even one soul becomes fully awake. And that is you. The empath who stopped performing pain. The empath who went quiet, not in defeat, but in power. The empath who turned inward and found infinity. That is your quiet exit. Not a goodbye, but a beginning written in silence, spoken in presence, and sealed in peace. And so, the story ends where it truly begins, in silence. Not the silence of absence, but the silence of arrival. The kind of silence that follows a long storm, when the winds have stopped howling and the air carries that still, sacred weight of renewal. This is what the empath's journey was always leading to, not to victory, not to revenge, but to freedom. Freedom from the need to be understood. Freedom from the compulsion to fix what was never yours to fix. freedom from the cycle of emotional servitude disguised as love. You've learned that not every soul that crosses your path deserves access to your energy. You've learned that empathy without consciousness becomes self sabotage. You've learned that love without truth becomes a prison. And now finally you are free. You walk through the world differently now. Your silence speaks where words once begged to be heard. Your eyes see through illusion without bitterness. Your presence feels like peace, but it carries a weight, the weight of someone who has seen everything, felt everything, and no longer needs to control anything. You have become the archetype. Jung spoke of the fully realized self, the individual who has faced both shadow and light and no longer needs to divide them. You are not chasing goodness anymore. You are wholeness itself. You are the storm and the calm, the question and the answer, the wound and the healing. There is a gravity to you now. The same people who once tested your patience now lower their voices in your presence, not because you demanded respect, but because you emanate it. You no longer need to assert boundaries. Your energy enforces them naturally. You no longer need to seek closure. Your silence has become the closing chapter. And in that stillness, something deeper has awakened grace. Not the fragile grace of perfection, but the grounded grace of authenticity. You have forgiven, not because they earned it, but because you have released the need to carry their weight. You no longer drink from the well of resentment. You have outgrown the poison of reaction. You see now that revenge was never your language, evolution was. You don't return what they gave you. You return what they taught you. Peace, detachment, power. That is the empath's darkest and most divine revenge. To rise so quietly that the world cannot even find the version of you that once hurt. And now you understand Jung's most haunting truth, that every soul's purpose is to bring the unconscious into light, to transform pain into meaning, and to walk the earth as a vessel of awareness. You, the empath, have done this. You descended into chaos to learn compassion. You faced your own shadow to learn discernment. You walked away in silence to learn self-respect. And now you stand where few ever reach, not above others, but beyond illusion. You no longer identify as the wounded healer. You are the healed witness. You carry no malice, no attachment, no noise, only presence. And when you move, life listens. When you speak, truth follows. When you love, it is without fear. When you walk away, it is without regret. Because you have learned that love is not proven by suffering. It is proven by freedom. It is proven by peace. You are the quiet revolution of consciousness itself, a living testament that one can be gentle and unbreakable, compassionate and sovereign, loving and untouchable. So let the world wonder where you went. Let those who once drained you search for you in others and find only echoes. They will never find what they lost, because what they lost was not you. It was access to the sacred. Your silence is their mirror. Your peace is their lesson. Your evolution is their reckoning. And you have already moved on. You live now in a different vibration, where energy is sacred, where solitude is sanctuary, where peace is the loudest sound. This is the final act of the empath story, to disappear from the chaos, to return to the self, and to become so whole, so luminous, so inwardly free, that even the darkness must bow before your light. You no longer walk through the world looking for love. You are love, quiet, deep, sovereign, unstoppable. And that silence that once scared everyone has become your crown. Your exit was not revenge. It was resurrection, and your silence, your beautiful, holy, untouchable silence, was the sound of your soul finally coming home.